In Unit 5, we're going to take a look at memory and thinking and how we process what we see and how we store it and how we eventually retrieve what we have stored in our memory. To begin with, those are your three essential statements we're going to take a look at. The first being the process of memory. Think of it as a giant wheel that's going around in your brain. You encode it, you store it, and then you retrieve it. So when we look into encoding, what you're doing is you're recording the information that your senses are seeing or tasting or so forth. So the encoding process is taking what you see, for example, transferring it in your nervous system to be later stored. So we think of our five senses. All of our senses are establishing some type of memory, and it's being encoded. There are different encoding codes, so the ways that you are encoding what you see. Some people like to do the acoustic type of code, where you just repeat it over and over and over again out loud, or maybe kind of out loud to yourself in your brain, to eventually be stored. Others are visual, so you create a mental picture of a word that you just saw or something that just happened. So for example, if I had on a piece of paper an apple, you would visually see an apple to help remember that or encode it. The last one being semantic, okay, trying to make sense of it, and this is very much individualized. People use those semantic codes in different ways. One way that you can see is we're using face to remember the notes of the treble clef, so you have your F, A, C, E. Every good boy does fine is another type of semantic. My very eager mother just served nachos is another. Thinking of mnemonic devices is a way to do semantic coding. So remember, encoding is all how are you recording what you're seeing, what you're smelling, and so forth to be later stored. Okay. In storing, this process of your memory is you are storing the information for later use, for when you decide to retrieve it or call upon that information again. Okay, the amount stored depends on the effort. So if you put a lot of effort into studying and you study 20 minutes every day for a week, you are probably going to be able to store quite a bit of information to later be recalled. But let's say you cram the night before a test. You are not really putting a lot of effort into encoding, into remembering that information, so when semester test time comes, you would probably forget a good majority of it. There are different types of memory, so different places that you have in your brain that are storing what you see or taste and so forth. So the different types are your sensory memory, your short-term, and your long-term. To begin with, your sensory. Okay, what you're doing with your sensory is your senses are holding information for a very, very short amount of time. So an example to think about is when you go to a movie. You don't know that in between each frame of image that you're watching, there's actually a little bit of a black screen. It's for a very fraction of a second. The reason why you don't see that little gap is because your sight is holding on to the previous image until another one appears. So it runs into a smooth transition. Short term, very limited capacity. Generally, it has kind of a limit of 7 items. So if you have to remember a phone number, most of the time you're going to remember that for a short amount of time. The last one being long term. Okay, storing it over a long period of time. You are trying to connect it with something you have already learned or experienced, and generally that's an easier way to store information for a longer amount of time. So take a step back, your sensory memory. Okay, the reason why you only hold it for a short amount of time in your sensory memory is, number one, to prevent you from being overwhelmed. If you think about your 5 senses and think about everything that you see and hear and touch and smell and taste on a daily basis, if you were to store that information for a long amount of time, it would be extremely overwhelming. Also, to decide whether or not it's important. If you sit in a classroom, you don't remember every single thing that you see because your brain has kind of filtered, your sensory memory has filtered what is important and what is not. So things that I might write on the board would probably be deemed important versus the names of the books that I have on my bookshelf. Like mentioned earlier, short-term memory has a very limited capacity, generally to 7 numbers or 7 items. it's why it's very easy for you to remember a phone number. 7 digits, you can remember that phone number, but eventually you're going to lose that because it's only being stored in your short-term memory. If I were to give you a list of 20 grocery items, more than likely you won't remember all, but you will remember maybe 7, maybe 5. Okay, there are ways that we keep this information, or ways that you can maybe keep your short-term items for longer durations. One of the ways is being maintenance rehearsal. So that's repeating it over and over again so that you remember it. So if you're trying to remember a phone number to go dial into a phone, you might look it up on the internet, or you might look it up in the phone book. You'll repeat it to yourself a couple times, and then once you type it in and you dial it, you probably have already forgotten it. Now, if you're able to maybe remember your own phone number in the drop of a hat, that is no longer stored in your short-term memory. You have worked it into your long. Another way to kind of improve your memory for short-term is chunking it, grouping it so it's easier to recall that information. So generally, that's why phone numbers are grouped in 3s and 4s. You can also chunk it into 2s or 3s. So for example, the phone number that you can see there, 555-6794, could become 555-6794, instead of remembering each individual digit. The last one is primary recency, meaning that you remember the first part of a list and the last part, but you forget everything that was in the middle. So like I said earlier, if I gave you a list of maybe 20 grocery items, you could probably recall maybe the first 3 or 4 and the last 3 or 4, but you might forget everything else that was in between. There is another type of memory dealing with short-term, and that's working memory. It includes both your short and your long, and incorporates it kind of into one. So short meaning events that you just saw happen, and long recalling that information for a current situation. So maybe something you just witnessed is something very similar that's stored in your long-term memory, an event that was very similar to that. Working memory is kind of including and incorporating both of those. When we talk about your long-term memory, remember that's where you're storing that information over an extended period of time. Okay? Connecting it with things that you have previously learned, maybe in another class, or maybe an experience that you've previously already had. There are different types of long-term memory. Okay, we have the semantic long-term memory. That's your knowledge of language and facts. Think of your conversations that you have on a daily basis. Okay, the way that you're talking, you have remembered maybe the different types of language rules that we have out there. Or facts, meaning information that you recall from classes that you've studied. Episodic is memory of your own life. Okay, recalling things that maybe happened 10 years ago. You can probably recall the first house that you lived in when you were little. Okay, that's using memory of your own life, your own experiences. Declarative is kind of including both, including your knowledge of language and facts, relating it with your own memory of your own experiences. And procedural, okay, it's your ability to do something without really knowing that you are doing it. Things that you've learned through either classical conditioning or just over practice. Right now, you could be writing down your notes. You probably don't remember the writing process. It's just something that's kind of ingrained in your mind that you could do unconsciously. Same thing as maybe shooting a basket. Now let's take a look at the retrieval process. Okay, retrieval is recalling information that you have stored in either, and most likely, your long-term memory. Okay, so you're bringing that information to your mind from storage. Okay, the easier it is for you to retrieve that memory, it means that you encoded it and you stored it very, very well. So your ability to retrieve information for a test means you spent some time probably in remembering it, stored it in your long term, and now can write it out. There are several methods for retrieval. Okay, we see recognition. Okay, recognition is identifying an experience. Okay, in my example I have on there, you may not remember your first grade teacher off the top of your head, but if somebody else says it, you would recognize, oh yes, I remember that. That's kind of your light bulb moment. Okay, you would recognize the beat of a song that was maybe played on different instruments. Recall is reconstructing what you maybe have previously experienced. Okay, and if you watch this video that I have on here, it kind of relates to why police officers generally will try to interview witnesses right away, because sometime with your reconstructive process of what you experience, you can kind of create false memories. There are different ways to improve your memory and your recall. A lot of the encoding processes that you use can also be used with the retrieval process. Okay, so rehearsal. Okay, relating information to something you already know is a way to help increase your memory in your retrieval process. So remembering these random words of D, F, I, R, and E, well, you could rearrange it to make friend. You know the word friend, so you have related it to something that you already know. A mnemonic device using associations, so my very eager mother just served us nachos, is a way to remember the order of the planets. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. Remember, Pluto is no longer considered a planet. Okay, so that is memory, kind of the processes of memory, the different types of memory, and ways that you can retrieve what you have stored and recall all your information.